You know that device in your pocket right now? The one you probably checked about 5 minutes ago? Yeah, that one. Ever wonder who made it possible? I'm talking about a man who started with nothing, got abandoned at birth, dropped out of college, got fired from his own company, and still managed to change the world more than almost anyone in the last 50 years. Today we're diving deep into the life of Steve Jobs. And I promise you this story is nothing like what you think you know. Listen, I want to tell you about a kid who was given up for adoption the moment he came into this world. February 24th, 1955, San Francisco. His biological mother, a young graduate student named Joanne Schkiebel, and his father, a Syrian immigrant teaching assistant named Abdul Fattah Jandali, weren't married. And back then in the 50s, that mattered. Her father threatened to disown her if she kept the baby, so she made an impossible choice. The adoption had conditions, you see. Joanne insisted that her son go to college-educated parents. The first couple backed out when they found out the baby was a boy. They wanted a girl. Then came Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple from Mountain View, California. Paul was a machinist and repo man who never finished high school. Clara worked as an accountant. They weren't college graduates. When Joanne found out, she refused to sign the adoption papers. For months, this baby existed in limbo. Finally, Paul and Clara made a promise they would make sure the boy went to college. Only then did Joanne sign. They named him Stephen Paul Jobs. Now, Paul Jobs was the kind of father who could fix anything with his hands. He had a workbench in the garage, and on weekends he'd restore old cars to sell them for profit. When Steve was about 5 or 6, Paul marked off a section of that workbench. "This is your section," he told the boy. He taught Steve how to take things apart and put them back together. How to recognize quality craftsmanship. Paul had this philosophy: you finish the back of a cabinet even if no one sees it, because you know it's there. That idea, that obsession with what's hidden, it stuck with Steve forever. But Steve wasn't easy. He was bored in school, constantly in trouble. He and his friends pulled pranks. Once they put a small explosive under a teacher's chair. The teacher was traumatized. Steve got suspended multiple times. His parents had to move to a better school district just to keep him engaged. They ended up in Los Altos, right in what would become Silicon Valley, though nobody called it that yet. Here's where it gets interesting. Steve met a kid named Bill Fernandez in the neighborhood, and Bill introduced him to someone who would change everything, Stephen Wozniak. Woz was 5 years older, already in college, and he was an electronics genius. These two Steves, they just clicked. Woz would show off his circuit boards, and Steve would get excited about what they could become. Even as a teenager, Steve wasn't thinking about how things worked. He was thinking about what they could mean to people. They pulled their first scheme together in the early 70s. Woz discovered you could make free long-distance phone calls by mimicking the tones the phone company used. He built a little blue box that could do it. Steve immediately saw the potential. "We should sell these," he said, and they did. $50 a box, sometimes more. They made a few $1,000s before it got too risky. Steve later said if they hadn't made blue boxes, they wouldn't have made Apple. It taught them they could build something together and change the world with it. Steve went to Reed College in Portland in 1972, keeping his parents' promise to his biological mother, but he dropped out after one semester. The tuition was eating up his working-class parents' savings, and he didn't see the point in taking required classes that didn't interest him. But here's the brilliant part. He didn't leave campus. He dropped in on whatever classes fascinated him. He slept on floors in friends' dorm rooms. He returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food. He walked 7 miles every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. And he took a calligraphy class just because it was beautiful. The teacher taught about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. Steve said later that if he'd never dropped in on that single course, the Mac would never have had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. You see how that works? A random decision made because something seemed beautiful shapes the future of computing. Makes you think about how many important moments we walk past because we're too busy following the plan, doesn't it? He came back to California in 1974, and Woz had been going to these meetings, the Homebrew Computer Club, where hobbyists shared ideas about building personal computers. At the time, computers were massive, institutional things. Regular people didn't have computers, but these dreamers at Homebrew imagined a different world. Woz designed a computer board just for fun, just to show off at the club meetings. He had no intention of selling it. But Steve saw it and saw the future. "We should start a company," Steve said. Woz was working at Hewlett-Packard, had a stable job, thought Steve was crazy, but Steve was persistent. Always persistent. Finally, Woz agreed. They needed startup money. Steve sold his Volkswagen van for a few $100. Woz sold his beloved HP 65 calculator. They had about $1,300. Steve suggested the name Apple. He'd been working at an apple farm and he liked that the name came before Atari in the phone book. That's the level they were thinking on, practical and simple. April 1st, 1976, they made it official. 3 partners, the 2 Steves and a guy named Ron Wayne who provided some business guidance and drew the first Apple logo. Wayne got nervous about the risk after a couple weeks and sold his 10% stake for $800. You know what that stake would be worth today? Over $200 billion. Sometimes I wonder if Ron Wayne can even look at an iPhone without crying. They built the first 50 Apple I computers in the Jobs family garage. Paul Jobs helped, of course, working alongside his son. Steve sold them to a local computer store for $50 each, even though they cost almost that much in parts, but it got their name out there. They sold about 200 units total. It was enough to keep going. The Apple II launched in 1977, and this was different. This had a case, a keyboard, color graphics, sound. Woz's engineering was brilliant, but Steve's vision made it a product. He obsessed over the design. The case had to be perfect. The power supply had to be silent. Mike Markula, an early investor who put in $250,000 and provided mentorship, helped them get organized. The Apple II became one of the most successful personal computers ever made. It sold for nearly 2 decades. By 1980, Apple went public and Steve was worth over $200 million. He was 25 years old. But success brings complexity. Apple hired a professional CEO named John Sculley from Pepsi. Steve actually recruited him with maybe the most famous pitch in business history. Do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley came. At first they worked well together, but Steve was difficult. He had this way of seeing people as either brilliant or worthless, nothing in between. He'd call someone's work garbage right to their face. He could reduce people to tears in meetings. His employees called it the reality distortion field. When Steve believed something, he made you believe it too, even when it seemed impossible. He poured everything into the Macintosh, which launched in 1984 with that famous Super Bowl commercial directed by Ridley Scott. The Mac was revolutionary, the first mass-market computer with a graphical user interface with windows and icons and a mouse, but it was also underpowered and overpriced. Sales disappointed. And Steve's management style was becoming a problem. He had divided Apple into warring camps, the Mac team versus everyone else, and it was tearing the company apart. The board had to make a choice. By 1985, they chose Sculley. At 30 years old, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he'd founded in his parents' garage. He felt betrayed. Devastated. He later described it as getting the wind knocked out of him for months. He thought about running away from Silicon Valley entirely. Maybe he could become an astronaut. He actually inquired about going on the space shuttle. But then something shifted. He realized he still loved what he did, so he started over. He founded Next Computer, aiming to build advanced machines for universities, and he bought a small computer graphics division from George Lucas for $10 million. That division was called Pixar. At the time, nobody knew what Pixar would become. They made high-end graphics computers. The computers didn't sell, but they had some talented animators who made short films to demonstrate the technology. Steve spent years in what he later called his wilderness period. Next computers were technically sophisticated but commercially unsuccessful. They sold maybe 50,000 machines total. Steve was burning through money. He had to invest more and more of his own fortune to keep both companies afloat. People wrote him off. The tech press called him a has-been, a one-hit wonder who got lucky with Woz's talent, some of his darkest years, honestly, but also his most important years because they taught him things success never could have. He learned patience, he learned to listen a little better, and he met Laurene Powell at Stanford, where he was giving a lecture in 1989. They married in 1991. She brought stability to his life, gave him a family. They had 3 children together, Reed, Aaron, and Eve. Steve also had a daughter, Lisa, from a previous relationship with a woman named Cryan Brennan. Steve initially denied he was the father, which is one of his most painful failures as a human being. He was cruel about it, actually, but eventually they reconciled, and Lisa took his last name. Here's the turning point. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a cultural phenomenon. Pixar went public 1 week after Toy Story opened, and suddenly Steve's investment had made him a billionaire again. Pixar went on to create masterpiece after masterpiece, Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Wall-E Up. Steve was chairman, and he learned crucial lessons about storytelling, about the importance of narrative and emotion in technology. Meanwhile, Apple was dying. The company that exiled Steve was failing without him. By 1996, they were weeks from bankruptcy. They needed a new operating system, and in a twist of fate, they bought Next for over $400 million. The exile was asked to come home. Steve returned as an advisor in 1997, then became interim CEO. He looked at Apple's bloated product line, dozens of computers that nobody wanted, and he did something radical. He killed almost everything. He narrowed it down to 4 products: consumer desktop, consumer laptop, professional desktop, professional laptop. That's it. People thought he was insane. But it brought focus, it brought clarity. Then he started creating. The iMac in 1998, translucent and colorful and nothing like the beige boxes everyone else was selling. It was a hit. Apple was profitable again. But Steve was just getting started. The iPod in 2001 changed how we listened to music. 1,000 songs in your pocket, he said. Then iTunes, which gave people a legal, easy way to buy music digitally. He convinced the record labels to unbundle albums and sell single songs for 99 cents. That saved the music industry from piracy, though they didn't fully appreciate it at the time. In 2007, Steve stood on stage and said they were introducing 3 revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet device. Then he let the audience figure it out. These weren't 3 devices, they were one, the iPhone. That device created the smartphone era. Everything changed. Within a few years, there were apps for everything, entire businesses built on top of what Apple had created. The iPad came in 2010, and though people initially dismissed it as a big iPhone, it created an entirely new category of computing. By the time Steve died, Apple was the most valuable company on earth. Think about that trajectory, from exile to creating maybe the greatest corporate turnaround in history. But there's something I haven't told you yet, something that shaped those final years. In 2003, Steve was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, specifically a rare form called a pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. This kind is actually treatable if you catch it early, and they caught it early. Here's where Steve made perhaps his worst decision. He refused surgery for 9 months. He tried alternative therapies, special diets, acupuncture, herbal remedies, juice cleanses. He wanted to treat it his way. His family begged him to have the surgery. His wife, his friends, his doctors, they all pleaded. But Steve thought he could bend reality to his will like he'd done with everything else in his life. By the time he finally had the surgery in 2004, the cancer had spread. He never really recovered. For the next 7 years, he fought it privately, disappearing for medical leaves, coming back thinner, more frail. He got a liver transplant in 2009 in Memphis. The press speculated, but Apple kept things quiet. Steve kept working, kept innovating. He was at that keynote introducing the iPad 2 inches March 2011, gaunt but present. But the cancer was winning. He resigned as CEO in August 2011, handing the company to Tim Cook, the operations genius he'd brought in years earlier. Tim was the steady hand Steve knew Apple needed. Steve Jobs died on October 5, 2011, at his home in Palo Alto, surrounded by his family. He was 56 years old. In his final moments, he looked at his sister Mona, then at his children, then at his wife Lorene, and then over their shoulders, as if seeing something beyond them. His sister later described how he seemed to be looking at something beautiful that none of them could perceive. Those were his last moments, peaceful and surrounded by the people he loved. Here's what makes Steve's story so complicated. He was a genius, visionary. He changed computing, music, phones, animation, retail, Apple stores. That was him. The idea that technology should be beautiful and intuitive, that was him, but he was also cruel sometimes. He denied his daughter. He made people cry. He rejected the science that might have saved his life earlier. You compare Steve to someone like Bill Gates, who was maybe more ruthless in business, but eventually became one of the world's great philanthropists. Steve wasn't interested in charity. He shut down Apple's philanthropy programs when he returned as CEO. Some people can't forgive that. Others say his contribution was the products themselves, that an iPhone has done more to help people than most charitable foundations ever could. What's his legacy now, years after his death? Apple is worth over $3 trillion. The iPhone is everywhere. But more than that, Steve proved something about the intersection of technology and humanity. He believed that people didn't know what they wanted until you showed it to them. Henry Ford said if he'd asked people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. Steve understood that. He didn't do market research. He imagined the future and built it. Tim Cook has done a remarkable job running Apple. He's made it more profitable, more valuable, but he hasn't created a new category-defining product like Steve did. Maybe nobody could. Or maybe Apple is now a different kind of company focused on refinement rather than revolution. Is that bad? I don't know, but it's different. When I think about Steve's life, I think about how a kid given up at birth who dropped out of college, who got fired from his own company, somehow became one of the most influential people of the last century. That's not a simple story of talent or intelligence. Plenty of people have those. It's about vision, about persistence, about being willing to fail spectacularly and get back up. It's also about recognizing that brilliant people can be deeply flawed. Steve could see the future of technology, but couldn't see that denying his daughter would hurt her terribly. He could design products that worked intuitively for millions, but couldn't intuitively understand how his harshness damaged the people around him. His sister Mona Simpson gave a eulogy at his memorial service. She talked about how Steve approached his final days the same way he approached everything else in his life, with intention and care. She said he was never embarrassed about working hard, even if the task seemed insignificant. That came from Paul Jobs and that workbench, I think. Finish the back of the cabinet, even when no one else can see it. Steve Jobs doesn't have a legacy of foundations or hospitals with his name on them. His legacy is in your pocket. It's in how we listen to music, how we communicate, how we think about what technology can be. He proved that engineers and artists aren't opposites, they're partners. That the humanities and sciences need each other to create things that matter. Would he be happy with Apple today? Probably not entirely. He was never entirely happy. That restlessness, that dissatisfaction, that's what drove him. It's also what made him hard to be around, but it's what made him Steve Jobs. The kid from the garage who felt abandoned, who struggled in school, who got fired and came back, who changed everything and died too young. That's the story, not a simple one. Not always an admirable one, but undeniably an important one. And that's how he's living now, not in person anymore, but in the shape of the world he left behind.